my previous videos, I described how the Waikato and Ngāti Maniapoto invasions of Taranaki left it desolate for around 10 years before the New Zealand Company bought the land from Te Atiawa, on the condition that 10% would be allocated to Māori. Taranaki Māori were then able to return to their homeland to live under the protection of the European settlers. However, trouble soon began when the Taranaki Māori who had been taken as slaves during the Waikato invasions were allowed to return. Some had been educated by resident missionaries while being held as slaves, and the missionaries encouraged them to claim back their land, for which they had never been paid. This, of course, created problems for the new settlement, especially as the returning slaves were in the majority. Following the treaty at Waitangi, the New Zealand Company purchases were set aside to be reassessed by Commissioner William Spain. Spain refused to accept that the returning slaves had any rights to the land they had once occupied when he reduced the land for European settlement in Taranaki to 60,000 acres, from present-day New Plymouth up to Waitara. This was most likely a fair assessment, as Te Atiawa had sold all the land in Taranaki when they only had rights to Ngāmotu and Waitara. You can see on Augustus Carrington's map, which was produced at the time of Spain's allocation, and included all the Te Atiawa land from Ngāmotu to both sides of the Waitara River. Māori complained to the governor, and Governor Fitzroy supported the returning slaves and reduced Spain's allocation to just 3,500 acres centred on the fledgling New Plymouth town, resulting in most of the settlers losing their farms to returning Māori. Finally, in 1848, Kingi sold the land he had conquered in Kapiti in order to return to his home in Waitara. Now, Waitara was in the process of being settled by Europeans, and the governor, George Grey, forbade Kingi from occupying that land, offering him land on the northern border instead. But Kingi refused and reoccupied Waitara anyway, and he subsequently farmed the land successfully for the next 10 years. Taranaki Māori benefited hugely from the European presence, earning money by working on European farms, which they then used to develop their own farms. By 1856, they had over 2,000 acres in cultivation and owned 218 horses, 692 cattle, 1,226 pigs, 110 carts, 102 ploughs, 45 harrows, and 7 threshing machines. This was all described by Benjamin Wells in his book, The History of Taranaki, which he published in 1878. I've provided a link to a PDF copy of this book in the description below if you're interested in reading. So in spite of these early problems, there appeared to be real potential for both Māori and the settlers to live in harmony and prosperity. However, as more and more settlers arrived in New Plymouth, they needed more land for farming. Much of the best land belonged to Māori and was not being utilised. While many Māori were keen to sell, there was a growing concern that the European settlers would soon outnumber Māori and push them off their land, which argument was being actively promoted by the missionaries. So the early disputes over selling land were mostly between local Māori, where some wanted to sell and others were determined to keep their land. This resulted in some bitter infighting and some deaths. It all came to a head in 1859 when Te Era, a minor chief who owned title to 600 acres on the left bank of the Waitara River, offered it for sale. He and Kingi had quarrelled and Te Era wanted to sell the land to obtain utu. However, this was before the land titles had been individualised, and Kingi regarded the land as part of their tribal land. He vehemently opposed the sale. He wrote to Governor Gore Brown stating that the land was tribal land that belonged to them all, and he would never allow it to be occupied. It was Tiara's father who had given Kingi permission to settle on the left bank of Waitara, and he also didn't agree with Tiara's sale. However, Governor Gore Brown accepted that Tiara owned the land and that he had the right to sell it, and the sale went ahead. To put this in perspective, Wiremu Kingi had claimed Waitangi by right of conquest, which he then sold on condition that he could only return to the Waitara if he occupied the land to the north of the Waitara River. The Waikato tribes also claimed all of Taranaki by right of conquest and refused to accept that Kingi or any other Te Atiawa had the right to sell. The New Zealand company had paid Te Atiawa for the land. Then the colonial government paid Te Wherowhero again for the land. In spite of this, Governor Fitzroy limited New Plymouth to a much smaller area than was needed for the full development of the settlement. There was not enough land for the settlers to farm, and farms that had already been established were given to Māori. Relations between Māori and the settlers had begun harmoniously, but they progressively degenerated as the settlers' need for more land conflicted with Māori refusal to sell. The settlers viewed Wiremu Kingi as a belligerent liar who couldn't be trusted, while Kingi claimed that he was simply returning to tribal land that he had never sold. Plus, he had occupied and successfully farmed the land for the past 10 years. However, Governor Gore Brown believed that the 600-acre Peka Peka block in Waitara had been legitimately purchased, and he began to survey the land. In February 1860, the survey was disrupted by the Waitara Māori, who were then fired upon by government troops. Gore Brown declared martial law on the 20th of February and arrived with more government troops soon after. Wiremu Kingi appealed to the Waikato tribes for help. Rewi Maniapoto had been determined to stop the sale of more land in the Waikato and was consequently willing to help in Taranaki. Even though the Māori king directed him not to get involved, he sent a large number of his Ngāti Maniapoto warriors to fight. Many other Waikato warriors also joined in. Māori initiated the fighting, killing cattle and sheep, as well as 3 settlers and 2 children just south of New Plymouth. Many more were killed in the subsequent fighting. The outlying farms built by the settlers were vacated and left for the Maoris to plunder. Most of the women and children were then relocated to Nelson by boat. Those who stayed behind were subject to ambush if they moved outside of the settlement, and this included the killing of unarmed women and children. Governor Gore Brown then accused Waikato Māori of interfering in a dispute that didn't concern them, and he issued an ultimatum to disband the King movement. Plans for a full-scale invasion of the Waikato were to be prepared if they did not comply. The true situation in Taranaki was way more complex. When government troops invaded Taranaki to take control of Waitara on the 27th of June 1860, they were repulsed by Te Atiawa, who was supported by Ngāti Maniapoto and a collection of Waikato warriors. This was a crushing defeat for the government, with 30 killed and 34 wounded. The humiliation focused the government's attention on the involvement of Waikato, and especially of Rewi Maniapoto, for interfering. Fighting had also extended down the coast to Amata, just south of New Plymouth, effectively surrounding the settlement. The settlers and troops were crowded together inside New Plymouth, where the conditions deteriorated to the point where people were dying of infectious diseases like scarlet fever. Within the first few months of 1861, more than 50 settlers had died of disease. Another development was the death of Te Wherewhere in Narua on the 25th of June 1860. In spite of government hopes that the Kingi movement would die with him, he was succeeded by his son Matutaira. Even though the Maori king and Wiremu Tamahana didn't want to become involved in the fighting in Taranaki, there were many other Waikato chiefs that supported Riwi Maniapoto. Neither Te Wherewhere nor his son Matutaira had effective control over the other Waikato hapu. Governor Gore Brown didn't trust either the Maori king or Wiremu Tamahana, and he became convinced that there could be no peaceful coexistence with Kingi because of the Waikato tribe's interference in Waitara. He issued an ultimatum to a large gathering of chiefs at the king's residence in Narua, stating that, and I quote, "The governor required submission without reserve to the Queen's sovereignty and the authority of the law, restoration of any plunder and compensation for all losses sustained." He then added that Maori who had set aside the authority of the Queen and the law forfeited the protection afforded to them under the Treaty of Waitangi, and that the land will remain their own so long only as they are strong enough to keep it. Might and not right will become their sole title. When he did not get his required response, Gore Brown advised the British government that there was nothing more he could have done, as Kingi had been spoiling for a fight all along. But desperate to find a solution, Governor Gore Brown called all the Maori chiefs to a conference in July 1860. The conference was held in Kohimarama on the Waitemata harbour, and every chief was encouraged to speak his mind on European colonisation, the potential for war over the situation in Taranaki, and the Maori King movement. This followed the 20 years of relative prosperity that was experienced after the treaty was signed. And the views expressed by almost all of the chiefs sheds light on the issues being canvassed today. Many spoke of the impact that the missionaries had, with most of the chiefs affirming how important Christianity was in bringing an end to their intertribal fighting. Likewise, they had fully embraced European law as far superior to their own tikanga. They understood that the Queen and the Governor had more mana than their own chiefs, and most were against the Maori King movement. Then Hamiora too spoke up about the rise of Kingi. Quote, "Welcome, welcome, welcome the multitudes of New Zealand. Listen to my fault-finding with the Governor, that is to say, our Governor. Had that evil, the Maori King movement, been dealt with at the commencement, it would have been arranged, but it has been allowed to come to maturity, and now you are angry with it. In my opinion, this is wrong. This is my wish. Let peace be established with Te Rangataki." I've provided a link to the full report on the conference in the description below. Sadly, the positive support and commitments expressed at this conference were to be severely tested when the war in Taranaki continued under the new governor, George Grey, especially when it spilled over into the Waikato and Bay of Plenty. Land was confiscated and the Maori economy was destroyed. Dismayed by what was happening, Wiremu Tamahana was determined to find a peaceful way forward. Following a meeting held in Narua, which was attended by many tribes from Auckland to Taupo, Tamihana agreed to travel to Taranaki to see if he could bring an end to the fighting. His objective was to appeal to the Queen and the British Parliament to investigate the title to the land in Waitara. On arriving in March 1861, he wrote to General Pratt requesting a ceasefire of 3 days to negotiate the settlement. Wiremu Kingi had agreed that Tamihana could negotiate on his behalf. Unfortunately, neither General Pratt Lord Governor Gore Brown trusted Tamihana, and the deal fell through. This was all described in more detail by Evelyn Stokes in her book Wiremu Tamihana, Rangatira. Tamihana later complained that if the governor had only listened to him, the war in Taranaki would not have blown out of control. After Governor Gore Brown finally agreed to investigate the Waitara sale, the Taranaki Māori seized the 4,000-acre Tataraimaka block southwest of New Plymouth as security to ensure that the Waitara land would be returned. This would later lead to further fighting when George Grey took over as governor. The war that followed left the local economy in tatters. Around 200 settler farms were destroyed. The British military casualties were 238 killed or wounded. More than 120 people had died from disease while living in cramped conditions within the New Plymouth settlement. Similar numbers of Maori had been killed or wounded. As you can imagine, this loss of life and property poisoned the relationship between the settlers and Maori. What had started as a peaceful agreement to apportion land and live together for mutual benefit had disintegrated into warfare and mutual distrust. This was further complicated in 1862 by the return of Ngāti Mutunga and Ngāti Tama, the two Te Atiawa tribes who had invaded the Chatham Islands after slaughtering and enslaving the Moriori inhabitants there. They were also demanding the return of their land in Taranaki. J Fenton, in his book The Waikato War, described the impact that the fighting in Taranaki had on Māori attitudes to the settlers in Auckland. Quote, "The temporary cessation of hostilities at Taranaki liberated large numbers of the Waikatos, who had been actively assisting the Taranaki tribes in their operations against the troops, and these returning to their several districts helped in no small way to fan the glowing embers of rebellion into a flame. The few missionaries and the Pākehā Māoris residing with the natives had sharp notice to quit. Their goods and chattels were appropriated, and in some instances the Māori wives and half-caste children of the Pākehā were taken from them. A printing establishment which the government had erected at Te Awamutu was broken into by a mob of natives who smashed the machinery to pieces and ejected the superintendent, Mr. Gorst, who shortly after returned to England. The natives were growing more insolent day by day. The settlers in the outlying districts had an anxious time of it and became alarmed at the attitude which the Maoris assumed towards them, with whom in most cases they had been on amicable terms for years. The hitherto friendly greeting and shake of the hands ceased, and each party viewed the other with suspicion. It was no uncommon thing for armed natives to stalk boldly into the settlers' houses, squat down in the rooms unbidden, walk into the kitchen, appropriate the contents of the pots on the fire, and demand tobacco, pipes or matches. And if these were not given with a good grace, the unfortunate settler was treated with threats of a bloodthirsty character." End of quote. He describes how even Wiremu Tamihana, or William Thompson, was not able to calm down this antagonism. Quote, "The wise Wiremu Thompson, son of the great Te Wahara, knew of the pride and jealousy that raged in his people's hearts. He cautioned them against it and foretold their doom. They heeded him not. They cared more for the crafty and ferocious Ngāti Maniapoto chief Riwi. The doom that he prophesied was the doom of the Pākehā." End of quote. Consequently, the conflict in Taranaki, which was supported by Waikato Māori, also created fear in the settlers in Auckland. The years of prosperity and goodwill that followed the treaty had disintegrated over the sale of 600 acres of land in Waitara, along with broken promises over other purchases of land. The issues were complex, but at its core there was a loss of goodwill and trust on both sides, and this was being fanned into full-scale rebellion by the missionaries' hatred for the Wakefield's brand of colonisation. To be fair, the missionaries, like Henry Williams and Octavius Hadfield, were selfless individuals who had lived with Māori, teaching them by example to live at peace with each other. They understood that colonisation by the British was necessary to protect Māori, not just from the French who were showing an interest, but also from unruly European settlers and unauthorised private companies like the New Zealand Company. So who was right? Who was wrong? It wasn't black and white. The returning slaves had lost their mana, including their rights to the land. But the missionaries disagreed and encouraged them to reclaim their land back anyway. Weramu Kingi claimed that he had never sold his land in Waitara, even though some Te Atiawa chiefs accompanied the New Zealand Company representatives back to Ngā Motu in Waitara and agreed that Waitara was a perfect place for European settlement. Of course, this was upended when Te Tiriti was signed and Governor Hobson cancelled that agreement. The land for the settlers was subsequently reduced to 60,000 acres from Ngā Motu to Waitara by Commissioner Spain. But it was then reduced to 3,500 acres by Governor Fitzroy. Kingi's claim was supported by the missionary Octavius Hadfield, who wrote an article to that effect. Kingi subsequently occupied the land at Waitara and farmed it successfully for 10 years before a minor chief who claimed title to 600 acres in Waitara offered his land for sale. Kingi claimed mana over all the Waitara and refused to allow the sale. Countering this, Governor Gore Brown argued that the treaty gave every Māori the right to sell his land to the government, and allowing Kingi to overrule the sale would send the wrong message to the other tribes. Octavius Hadfield claimed that the governor only accepted the sale because he was offended that Kingi had treated him with disrespect when he refused to allow the sale. And we can never know if the New Zealand Company would have honoured their commitments to helping Māori build a prosperous new future. So regardless of who was right or wrong, the end result was a war that destroyed the fledgling Taranaki economy and poisoned relations between Māori and the settlers. This war would go on to engulf the Waikato and Bay of Plenty, all over 600 acres of land in the Waitara. George Grey took over from Thomas Gore Brown when he returned as governor on the 3rd of October 1861. He had been a good friend to both Te Wherowhero and his son Matutaira during his first term as governor. But this was before the establishment of the King movement. Te Wherowhero was now dead, and Matutaira had been elected as the new Māori king. How did George Grey react to these changes? I'll cover that in my next podcast. Finally, in my last video, I described the cost of the digital copy of my book, Moving Forward from Our Past, as being $11.95. That was the standard price set for Australia when sold through amazon.com.au. This becomes $13.90 when converted to New Zealand dollars. My apologies for any confusion.